So we'll go back to the top shell, and we're going to notice we've used only one brush this entire time. We're just going to continue using this lovely round brush with a nice fine point. And I'm going to stir up the gray, but then I'm really going to scrape the brush off, because what I want is to start having kind of a liney texture. And I'm going to look at the shell first and make sure in the light and make sure it's not too wet. I can definitely see the bottom one's very wet, but the middle two don't, or the middle and top don't look very wet. So I think it's a good time to brush this in. So again, a little scary. Put down your center line first and then come out from that line. So with a lined seashell, you want that line really straight in the middle if you're looking straight down at it, and then as you go out it gets slightly more curved, left to the left and right to the right, so it kind of mirrors the shape of the shell. We're not doing the fine lines right now, we're just doing those sort of thick gray lines going down the left side. A little bit more paint, I feel like I want it darker. So it's good to start light and then add more if you want, just like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the red. But now I'm going to use, well, yeah, let me see what happens if I put the darker red in. Not bad. So I'm going to start kind of mimicking these little scalloped edges. And outlining almost. Yeah. And then as I come up here on the left, there's a little sliver, and I'm going to add another line right there. And then the further I go to the right, the lighter the color gets. So I'm going to rinse and touch my towel and switch to the lighter red, reddish purple, and then just pull a little bit up here. And that's it, actually. That's all I'm going to do there. Now comes my opinion, the fun part. You get to blend it. So we're going pretty slow with this. I'm allowing a little bit of time to dry a little bit because I do want it to look liney. I want it, I don't want it to be a perfectly smooth texture. So I'm going to go back after I've rinsed and touched my towel and just wipe through some of these areas, but not all. Something like that. Rinse, touch. I got too much gray up there, so I'm going to wipe it off. And I'm going to wipe this edge so it softens. And then I have a little bit of residual color in my brush, so I'm going to use that to just start suggesting the lines on the right. And just blending I have these kind of large red dots. I'm going to just dab at those. I don't want those in there. Soften them out. Oh, and then on the left here I've got this edge which I want a little bit softer, so I'm going to go back and just brush at it to loosen it and get a little bit on the very outside edge. I accidentally made my shell stick out further with that stroke, so I'm just going to have a shell that sticks out further. No big deal. Alright, and the last thing I want to do for right now is add a little bit more of the ochre to the very tip top of this one. Just seems like it could use a little brightening. There we go. Rinse, touch, and dab up that drip. So we're not done with that one. We still have to go back and do details, but we're going to move back down to this one here. And that one actually looks pretty done, except for the dark red line, so we can do that now. You need a really tiny pointy brush for this, and we're going to use that dark, actually let's use the light red first. So just dip your brush in the light red, and you can see the line starts a little closer, the line starts a little closer to this edge than it does to the bottom. So you can make a pencil line if you want, you're welcome to draw those in. Actually, I should have mentioned you could do that before the class started too, before we painted. Or you can freehand it. But you want just imagine it's like a golf ball. It's like a perfect circle if it were to finish up here. So you're going to start about here and end about here, but really dip down, make a big smile, kind of mimic the same curve as the bottom of the shell. So once you have a sense of that in your head, then just start up here and paint. And if you go kind of quickly, it's actually a little bit easier. So you got something like that. Then we're going to do the other ones, which are easier because they're closer to the bottom. It's probably easier to do the very bottom one first, which is just your outlining. And we're still using the light red, even though those lines are dark, because we're laying down like the skeleton of what we want, and then we'll darken it with the dark color in a minute. So you're just going around that outside edge, pressing a little bit hard with your brush because you have a very tiny brush and you want a little bit of a thicker line than it would naturally provide with just the tip. Except when you get to the very end, lighten up on the pressure so it can be very, very fine and just sort of disappear off the side. Now this line is light, so we're not going to go over that again, but the bottom ones are not. So you can dip into the dark paint now, dark red, and go over that bottom line that you just created. And because it's still wet, it should create some variation, like not the whole, you don't want the whole thing to be the same darkness. So allow it to bleed into areas and not into others. And then I'm going to rinse and do the same thing. Actually, it's too dark over here on the left for me, so I'm going to go back and wipe some off. Rinse, touch the towel, go back and wipe, rinse, touch the towel. And I've made it a little gummed up over there, but that's okay. Just keep wiping. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the second line, which is going to be very close to the first. Try as best you can not to let them touch, but if they do, it's not the end of the world. It's just a natural variation in your painting. Feel free to hold your breath, but I recommend breathing if you possibly can, because I believe you'll get a finer line if you breathe. And don't worry if you accidentally, if your line goes off or something, or if it doesn't go exactly the way you want. Here, let me show you. Let's say oh gee, I made a mistake. Wow. So what do? Rinse, touch, go back and wipe. And that brush isn't working very well for that, so I need something that holds a little more water, so I'm going to use a little bit of a bigger brush and go back and wipe with some water. So you want to do this as little as possible because it tends to weaken your paper if you brush and brush over the same spot. And now I've got a little bit of a blend there, so rather than be upset that it's not perfect, I'm going to just continue it along the top of my band on both sides, and then it'll just look like part of the shell. So when you, quote, mess up with your painting, that's the best advice I can give, is allow it to become something different than you conceived of and something just as beautiful. So we've got those lines in. Now I'm going to go back and put in my darkest, thickest line, but I'm again going to start with the light color and start in the same place I started these two lines, but just go much higher with it. Oops, I made that a little straighter than I wanted, but that's alright. Now I'm pressing pretty hard with the bristles because I want a thicker line. And I'm painting right over that area that I just blended. And I just realized that's probably not the best idea in case it was still wet, but fortunately it doesn't seem to have done much, so I guess I'll just roll with that. And now I'm dipping in the darker color. I'm going to go back over it and darken. Another lovely thing about doing the dark over the light is you get just a little bits of the light showing through, so it's not, it's No, it just seems more natural. And lifting up at the very end. And I'm going to go back and just kind of pull that up. Pull the end up. So brushing through it, pulling up. And up around the side. I'm almost outlining it now because I just couldn't get that tip really, really fine. So I'm just going to go back around the outside edge. And that doesn't really matter anyway. I'm kind of being a perfectionist here without needing to be, because we are going to put on this dark gray shadow, which is going to hide that anyway. So it doesn't matter. I just feel like it. So now I'm just soaking up my drips. Touching the towel. There's a big drip over here of light color or water or something. Touch. Okay, now let's go on to the bottom one. So for that, I'm going to have you use a slightly thicker brush. This one is a number 1. Just a pointy little detail brush. And I'm going to just look at it in the light, make sure it's not too wet. And it's not shiny anymore. And I'm going to go back and put in the line work. So for that, I guess let's start with the ochre. And I'm going to paint in a band right here. I'm going to re-add this up here because that kind of all but faded out. And then I'm just going to put in some lines along the bottom here, going in the same direction as the shell, brushing right through and into the light area. And I'm doing this just for the purpose of kind of getting the texture on the shell. It's more of a suggestion of texture. Unlike this one or this one where the lines are really easy to see. This bottom one just doesn't really have that. And I'm going to use my large brush, rinse, touch with nothing on it, and just go back and brush those ends, sort of just wipe them. And you can see that every time I put my brush down I have a little color on it, so it leaves an edge, so that's why I'm going all the way over to the other edge to brush through them. And I'm going to do the same thing on the left, brushing into them, or out, doesn't really matter either way, because what you're trying to do is leave texture on the shell. Wow, I really like what that did. It doesn't look much like the reference, but it's a cool pattern. Now I'm starting to brush off color, which I'm on the left, so that's okay because it's really light over there anyway. But just be mindful of that. If you don't want to be brushing off color, you'll want to stop brushing. I'm going to smooth that out. Yeah, I really like what that did. Now I'm going to go back and add some darker red with my large brush because these lines are very thick. Again, a little bit scary, but don't panic. It's part of the art. And I'm not going to bring that all the way over because when I go back and blend it, that'll just naturally bring it all the way over. So I've added my 2 really dark bands, and I'm going to add a little bit on the very bottom edge, kind of going up into that first band. Rinse, touch, and pull this over to the right, and this over and off. Rinse, touch, same thing here. Rinse, touch. I'm going to be doing a lot of rinsing and touching. So here my edge is too sharp on the top, so I'm going to go back and just wipe that. Rinse, touch. Here, blend. Same thing here, just kind of pull into it. Rinse, touch. Rinse, touch. Alright, and I think I'm happy with that, although I really do want more gray in this one, in that core shadow area. So I'm going to get some more gray and drop it in just right there. Then rinse, touch, and go back and kind of manipulate it, soaking up any major drips. Rinse, touch, and just sort of dab along the edges and pointing my brush towards the sharp edge, dab that. There we go. Now I like it. Okay, now we're going to go back up to that top shell and add some lines So for that, I guess let's use the smallest brush again, this guy here, and we'll start with the dark red, and I'm just going to add, I'm going to move this so I can get my fist in there. Add lines, you're basically just outlining it at this point. Do try to keep the lines thick along the bottom by pressing a little harder, and then as you pull up, lift, lift, lift until your brush just sort of floats off the page. So you want to do this pretty slowly. Again, I wouldn't recommend holding your breath, but if you feel like it makes you feel better, go ahead. So thick along the bottom, pull up, up, up until it disappears. Sorry, I just realized you probably can't see that. There. So thick along the bottom, up, up, up till it disappears. Now we're getting into the lighter area, so I'm not going to reload my brush because I want the color to appear lighter as I keep going. And now I'm going to start curving my strokes a little bit the opposite direction. So we're going to go across the bottom and curving to the right instead of center or left. Pulling up. Kind of running out of paint. Pulling up. Now I'm going to get a little bit of the light red because I do need more paint, but oh, that doesn't look very light because I had too much dark red left on the brush. That's okay. We're going to go back and lighten this anyway. And all the way over to the right and up that side. Now I'm going to go back with some gray and continue the line. So I'm starting about halfway up, and I'm just going to pull them up towards the top, including this outside edge. If some are darker than others, that's actually really good. It is a natural object, so you want variation. But you can see what's happening is the lines are just getting, oops, I need a little bit more paint. So I rinse, touch, grab more paint, and just kind of pulling up towards the top. And I realize these are leaning too far, so I'm going to fix that. Rinse, touch, I'm going to try to fix it. I'm going to go back and wipe them off with my large brush. And now the surface is a little wet, so I'm not going to put the lines back in right away, because if I do, they'll probably just bleed. But you can still see ghosts of them. That's totally fine. It's going to just add to the complexity of the shell texture. While that's drying, I'm going to go back and just touch up some other things. So I want to lighten the shadow, or the reflected light, on the left side. So I'm going to use my large brush, because that's the one that's most effective in pulling color off. And just kind of, with the dampness of it, wipe the left side of each section. If it feels like it's getting a little muddy, just rinse, touch your towel or your sponge, and keep going until you feel like it's getting muddy again, and then rinse again. And I'm kind of creating edges at the top, so I'm going to go back and wipe those off. And this, I'm still going to give this another minute to dry. While that's doing that, I'm not happy with how intense my lines are, so I'm just going to go to the top edges and the left edges and soften them a bit using the very tip of my large brush. You can also do this with one of your smaller brushes, but it's easier to blend with a larger brush than it is a small one. So if you have a good tip on your large brush, hopefully you do, then this is the easiest way to do it. This one seems a little too blended also. Let's see, the light's coming from the right, so I would want to blend on this edge so that it looks like it's kind of curving up over that. So I'm kind of using this blending time as an opportunity to recreate these lines in a rounder way, and then I'll go back over them. And if that didn't happen to you, kudos. I'm sure it didn't. We don't all make the same mistakes. So I am going to go back over here now that these are mostly dry. Even though I've just blended them, I blended them in the direction I want them to go, so they shouldn't bleed out too much in the direction I don't want them to go. So I'm going to go back and reinsert them with the red. Rinse, touch. That one's a little intense. I'm going to go back and wipe some off. And this one I'm going to blend. I'm using my small brush, which, as I mentioned, is harder to blend with than the larger because you have to stroke, 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 stroke instead of just one brush. So I'm going to switch back to my large brush and just kind of wipe that. And all this brushing is creating this really liney texture on this shell, which is great. It lends itself to the natural texture of the shell, so we're going to just leave it. Alright, so while I was doing that, this is kind of drying, and I can see I'm getting a little bit of an edge here that I don't want because the paint is settling, so it's still wet, so I'm going to go back and just dab at it. Not too much, just enough to encourage it to soften a little bit, and I'm going to leave it. So now we can get on to our cast shadows.